The EU has a piece of absolutely monstrous regulation. It's called the Digital Services Act. You should not dignify it with that name. It's the Digital Censorship Act. It effectively dictates the content moderation policies that American social media companies can have. Climate change, abortion, gender issues, national identity issues, vaccine efficacy, any policy the EU wants to manufacture the consent of the European population, they can effectively force the tech companies under effectively bankrupting fines, allow them to essentially have godlike control.
Americans writing online from within America. Because of this service, you think that that will be throttled all over the world. Won't it just be throttled within the EU?
That is what they're saying right now. But in the NATO 2030 strategic concept, they called for a 24/7 disinformation monitoring system powered by artificial intelligence. You see 12,000 arrests in Britain, but it is like orders of magnitude more than get arrested in Russia.
It seems that this is an administration that at least proclaims to be very pro-free speech. I wanted your appraisal a few months into this second term of Trump. Mike Benz, great to have you back on the show. I'm a huge fan, and I loved our last conversation where you painted the Censorship Industrial Complex in tremendous detail. It's still one of our most popular interviews that we've ever done, even well over a year later. So thank you. And I know how precious your time is here running around Washington, D.C. Things have changed for you, and the establishment are properly listening. I saw an interview with Marco Rubio that you were interviewing him, and he seemed to be completely reiterating the Mike Benz worldview and the sort of Jacob Siegel understanding of the censorship industrial complex, as you've been calling it out for a long time now. So it's very interesting to come back and talk to you at this different period in your career.
Yeah, it's been an incredible journey, and for you as well. I think we each are fighting our own demons and institutions on either side of the Atlantic Ocean. Yeah. And I think we're all realizing we're all in it together. And what happens in one of our countries impacts what happens in the other, both in terms of overreach by the government, in terms of controlling speech, but also in terms of support for one another and being able to amplify each other's messages and exchange ideas. And that's such a big threat. I was testifying to the Brazil Foreign Affairs Committee about a month ago, and I played a clip of one of these USAID-funded NGOs doing a conference about the necessity of stopping, quote, the international exchange of ideas between the Bolsonaro movement in Brazil and the Trump movement in the U.S. So the Biden administration was funding NGOs to kill the ability for groups in America to talk to groups in Brazil, because that international exchange of ideas creates this very robust thought leadership and civil society alliance structure, which converts into political capital and electoral wins and hearts and minds. And so they don't want us talking together.
They don't want us talking together. And what I wanted to focus on in this conversation, if you don't mind, is what's going on with relation to the EU, the UK and the US. Why this is important? Well, the UK, you'll have no doubt seen that they're arresting comics now upon landing for tweets. That's after arresting all sorts of people for social media posts over the last year and even before then. But it's also been the case that the American establishment, J.D. Vance, for example, is constantly talking about free speech in the UK, how it's an important value. He said it was going to be part of the trade deal. And even today, Donald Trump has said he's alarmed about the free speech in the UK. So we'll come to the UK in one moment. But the EU, there's some big developments. Yes. Now, as we talk, there's a EU-US trade deal that's been negotiated. And our mutual friend, Michael Schellenberger, host of the Public website and one of the main Twitter Files journalists, having exposed Twitter Files France and collusion between Macron and the ancien regime of Twitter, his website, Public, now seems to have been blacklisted in France. I wanted to
for our protection.
Yes, the
That was,
protection of French.
that was the text in the warning. It was, this site has been blacklisted for your protection.
Right. So I wondered if you wouldn't mind unpacking for me the significance of this and why it's relevant to the trade deal, and how, if you can piece that together so that we can understand how this American concerns for censorship affects this EU deal.
Mm-hmm. So the EU has a piece of absolutely monstrous regulation called the EU DSA. It's called the Digital Services Act, but you should not dignify it with that name. It's the Digital Censorship Act. And it was percolating for a very long time before it was finally enacted. I actually was fighting against it while I was at the State Department. In 2020, this thing was being drafted and negotiated in tandem with something called the Digital Markets Act, which is more on the commerce side. But the Digital Censorship Act effectively dictates the content moderation policies that American social media companies can have. And it does so in a very cleverly, meticulously constructed series of understated threats, shall we say. So, for example, it forces something called a risk assessment on all the tech companies. And people think risk assessment, okay, that's some accounting, boring. How bad can a risk assessment be? Well, the risk there refers to disinformation risk, the risk that hosting certain types of content has on destabilizing a democracy, on undermining public faith and confidence in institutions.
Here's a quick word from our sponsor, Private Internet Access, or PIA for short. Using the internet without a VPN is like scrolling through social media with a blindfold on. PIA is the VPN trusted by over 30 million people worldwide to protect themselves online. You might be asking, what is a VPN? A virtual private network hides your IP address and encrypts your internet connection, helping to keep your data private. I personally don't use the internet without one, especially now being in Britain, because every time you browse the internet, you're handing over information to businesses, online retailers, and of course, the tech giants. Also, hackers can intercept this data with ease, from passwords to keystrokes, even your private photos. But PIA protects you. It secures your connection, keeps your data encrypted, and keeps cybercriminals out. And it's not just hackers you need to worry about. Increasingly, it's governments too. With legislation like Canada's Bill C-18 and Britain's Online Safety Act, as well as the EU Digital Services Act, more and more content is being censored, filtered before it even reaches your screen. PIA helps you bypass these restrictions, ensuring you still have access to the news, platforms, and information that matter to you. It works across all major devices: Windows, Mac, Android, iOS, Linux, and with one subscription, you can protect unlimited devices. The best part? We've secured a special offer. Click the link in the description and get 83% off, bringing it to over $2 a month, plus an extra 4 months free. And if you're unsure, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try completely risk-free. Head to piavpn.com/Winston Marshall to start protecting your digital freedom today.
And forces the tech companies to engage in a dialogue with the EU regulatory body over their policies about these various categories of disinformation, what they're doing to throttle or stop its distribution. And it's every policy issue you can imagine, whether it has to do with foreign policy and Ukraine, Russia, whether it has to do with public health, whether it has to do with vaccine efficacy, climate change, abortion, national identity issues, gender issues. Essentially, any policy that the EU wants to manufacture the consent of the European population to support, they can effectively force the tech companies under massive, effectively bankrupting fines to go through this very, very heavy compliance, oversight, and they call it accountability, but it's punishment process. These fines include up to 6% global annual revenue for every platform that doesn't comply with the disinformation code of practice. This is what they call it. There's a code of practice. It was voluntary up until July 1 of this year. So as we speak, this is just a few months it's been in effect. This is the code of practice on disinformation. It's now mandatory. And 6% global annual revenue, that's not 6% of your profits. So every dollar, for example, that Facebook makes in Pakistan or the Philippines is counted in that. To have to pay to the EU, they also have to pay the EU the costs of the compliance. It's not like, this is covered by Europe. So these are tens of millions of dollars already being bilked out of American companies just on the compliance side. But the threat that this has is that we just talked about the international exchange of ideas and how important it is to be able to hear each other's voices in our own countries. If X or Facebook or Instagram or YouTube were to lose the European market, it would be disastrous. It's 550 million people or so. It's an enormous market. I mean, in the aggregate, it's bigger than the American market. So what these companies are faced with is you go dark and there's a silicon curtain that descends over Europe, or American speech, posts in America or about American ideas or figures or politicians or developments can be effectively forced to be censored around the world, or else be kicked out of the European market or be fined into bankruptcy.
Let's just stop on that detail. So Americans writing online, let's say from within America, because of this service, the Digital Service Act, you think that that will be throttled all over the world? Won't it just be throttled within the EU?
That is what they're saying right now. But these things evolve I followed these people and what they lay out as their plans. For example, Brazil was that way as well. Last week, Brazil said it's actually global. They just changed this last week. They put the regulatory architecture in place, and then one of these tyrant judges on the Brazil Supreme Court said, actually, we can make it. This applies. The fines will apply unless you take it down globally, because people could still access that tweet through a VPN here in Brazil. If the post is visible, they could get around it, be exposed to this misinformation. So
that hasn't been explicitly said for the Digital Services Act.
It's not been explicitly said, but it has not been explicitly enacted. But that was always part of the conversation since the beginning, that it could expand to that. The reason they've structured it this way, with this clever kind of, it's a conversation rather than a hard black and white. We're not saying you can't allow criticism of vaccine efficacy. We're just saying public health disinformation is one of the categories that has to be included in your disinformation risk assessment. And then you will be assigned the commissioner from the EU regulatory, Digital Commission, who will be speaking to you on an ongoing basis about the harms of hosting these various kinds of. And what this allows them to do is effectively jawbone and adjust the fines, adjust the punishment to what is just below the political red line to motivate, for example, the White House or the State Department to stall a trade deal, or to put forward the expend the political capital necessary to do this. And the wall is closing on this very quickly. In the UK, for example, there's the analog with the Online Safety Act, and Ofcom is now pursuing 4chan and Kiwi Farms. If you've seen this, these are two highly controversial websites in the United States. Many a politician and high-level cultural figure have tried to take down 4chan and Kiwi Farms, but it's been very resilient. It's host to a lot of very extreme, inflammatory speech, but it's speech at the end of the day, protected under our First Amendment. But what the UK Online Harms Act essentially allows Ofcom to do is to say, you have not gone through our process. You have not hired the people to create a compliance team for our disinformation review. You've not complied with any of ours. And so now they're fining them, I think it's $20,000 a day, something like that.
Who's fining who?
Ofcom is is fining kiwi farms. I think it's $10,000 or $20,000 a day. It comes out to millions a year if left unpaid.
Wow.
And so 4chan has now filed suit in the U.S. To argue on First Amendment grounds that this cannot be enforced. Essentially, Ofcom can do what it wants, but we're not going to honor, as would be typical, the regulatory actions from the UK, and essentially calling on a change to the way we do business with Britain that we might not enforce these sorts of degrees.
I'm very keen to come to Britain. Before we do that, a couple of things about the EU that I want to understand. The first thing is that you have written that this Digital Services Act is an attempt to revive AI censorship.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So the AI side of this, can I start with one other anecdote about the EU Digital Services Act that will help illustrate that? So in September 2023, this is months before Mark Zuckerberg wrote that famous letter to our House Judiciary Committee Chairman, Jim Jordan, that he regretted censoring COVID-19 discourse, and he only did it because the Biden administration forced him. But for months before that, Mark Zuckerberg had been, and this is before his announcement that he had was getting rid of all the fact checkers, and there were like 40,000 fact checkers. That was their target to let go. But for months before that, Mark Zuckerberg had actually been making speech considerably more free on Facebook and Instagram, and had been following in Elon's footsteps. Elon closed the acquisition of Twitter 1.0 in, I think, October 2022. And between October 2022 and September 2023, it opened the floodgates considerably to free speech, not just on X, but on Facebook and even to a degree on YouTube, as this pressure, as government pressure was beginning to be beaten back because of the dissolution of the Disinformation Governance Board, the Republican-controlled House subpoenaing all these government agencies and tech companies and putting counter pressure on. There, one of the clips that I highlight here to sort of understand the significance from the U.S. side of this European Digital Censorship Act, it was a panel of 5 individuals. Speaking was the head of toxic conversations for Twitter 1.0, Rebecca Tremblay, I think was her name, together with 4 other operatives from the quasi-NGO, quasi-intelligence space. So, for example, one of them was Dean Jackson, who was at the National Endowment for Democracy for something like 7 years. The National Endowment for Democracy was created effectively by the CIA. It was the CIA director, William Casey's idea to set it up. Its founder said it exists to fund the organizations that the CIA used to fund, but they didn't want those groups to be scandalized by receiving payments from the CIA. So instead, it comes from the National Endowment for Democracy. It's very famously involved in color revolutions, regime change work, destabilization. He had just gone at that time from the National Endowment for Democracy to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was run for 7 years by Bill Burns, who was the head of the CIA under Joe Biden. And a whole range of similar characters. This is effectively a kind of tech platform, civil society NGO, intelligence stew. And the 5 of them are talking together on this conference about what to do about the state of free speech, because there was this deluge of misinformation, disinformation because of what Elon and Zuckerberg and the platforms were doing. How can we get our control back? And what the lead speaker said was, I would feel pretty defeated and despondent in this moment if it weren't for Europe. This is in September 2023. These are all Americans talking about their American discourse. They said, I would feel pretty defeated and despondent in this moment if it weren't for Europe. And then she says, we've spent years building up relationships within the platforms, and now they don't respond to our requests. There's nobody there that we can reach out to because they're all gone. These trust and safety teams have all been fired. But fortunately, Europe is about to have the EU DSA come into force, and this will give us options for leverage as companies feel the heat of enforcement from the disinformation risk assessments, from, quote, transparency requirements to share with outside researchers. And I'll break that down. And she ends by saying, and hopefully this will compel the restaffing of these people who were fired from the trust and safety team. So these are American censors in exile working together with Europe and banking on a European censorship law to get their American censorship jobs back, because they will have to be in order to comply with the European regulation or face potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. That is borderline treasonous to me as an American, that you have to rely on a foreign country's law to hold American companies and interests at gunpoint in order for you to bilk money out of a corporation for your own personal profit so you can get your own salaries and influence back, because that not just gets you the direct salary from the tech platform, but that now makes you a very powerful person who other networks will want to cozy up to and do favors for and give you a fat little sinecure at Stanford University. And why don't we make you a fellow at the Atlantic Council, and you'll get in good with us and you'll get your stipend from that. So, and that was 2 years ago. Now that's September 2023. And the way you asked about the AI censorship angle, the way AI censorship transformed the game in 2017 cannot be understated. This is a lot of people. I'm not talking about AI, the singularity threat or Skynet type stuff. I'm not talking about anything in the future. Before 2016, 0% of political speech or organic speech whatsoever on social media was censored or pre-censored or pre-filtered or flagged at all using artificial intelligence. 0%. There was AI used for content moderation before 2016, but it was for spam, which would just basically look at like rate of posting and a couple other like metadata metrics, and CP. I don't know if we're on YouTube and I can't say that phrase, but illegal child, type things. And that would simply, it's very rudimentary. It used a technique called near duplicate hashing, where there would effectively every, incident of such kind of picture or video would be in a database, and anyone who tried to post a picture that was a near duplicate of something in that banned illegal database would be pre-flagged by the AI. But no speech, not about elections, not about vaccines, not about climate change or energy policy or anything. In 2017, in Germany, a law was passed called NetzDG, which made it so that social media companies would face a $54 million fine for leaving incidents of hate speech up on their platforms for more than 48 hours after being notified. Now, that is an impossible. It effectively created a safe harbor if you have good faith systems in place in order to comply. You can't hire enough manual content moderators and adjudicate every single one of these when you're talking about this kind of volume. You need to hire 100,000 people for Germany alone.
The term hate speech, right, because it's such a loose term.
Right.
It really can mean anything.
Right. And there's so many false positives.
Yeah.
So, but that kind of safe harbor, it compelled AI filters to be put in place to comply with that law. And they proved very useful for essentially for market continuity, and because other countries were moving in that direction in a regulatory space. And there was actually pressure from the US government, from civil society organizations, from political lobbyists to use that same technology to go after political speech in general, not just hate speech in Germany. It became the standard. It solved what they called the whack-a-mole problem. When Brexit happened in June 2016 and Trump won in November 2016, they blamed it on social media because both sides, the mainstream press was completely on the other side. And but they could not hire enough human moderators. All the platforms tried. YouTube hired 10,000 new human moderators like in a month, made no difference at all. But with AI, you could simply take all the slogans, all of the hashtags, all of the prefixes and suffixes. You just take the dialect, you create a code book of language, and then you simply have a rudimentary sentiment analysis, or if someone says the phrase "stop the steal" with Biden illegitimate, for example, that would give a very high toxicity score in the AI, or very high disinformation or delegitimization. Every category is a little distinct with how they apply the filters. And that would not just pre-flag it in the system, but it would allow all measure of creative censorship possibilities. If you had a 99% confidence coming from the AI, it might automatically censor it. If it has a 80% confidence, it might allow the post to be visible, but shadow ban it in the algorithm. If it comes from a high-profile account that they're afraid there might be blowback, if this person is seen as being censored, they might allow the post to be up, not have it be technically shadow banned, but apply what they call a virality circuit breaker, so that it would essentially only hit a shadow ban trigger after it got something like 100,000 views or 200,000 views or the like, and allowed them to essentially have godlike control, not just over the distribution of content from the moment of posting for its entire duration, but to also control the public's perception of the censorship itself. They called this the martyr effect. And DARPA actually gave millions of dollars to groups to study this. For example, when Alex Jones was banned simultaneously by several platforms in 2018, and it was one of the first very, very high profile public figures to just be outright banned off of everything all at once. And there was a lot of social blowback, and folks were afraid of the extent of this being revealed, and they pointed to counterexamples, and it was leading to the cross-platform proliferation of this content. They said, we don't want to have this kind of problem as a go-forward thing. And so they funded millions of dollars of studies to places like the University of Washington, Harvard University, the Berkeley Data Science Lab, to all study how to create different kinds of censorship techniques that you could use with AI. You could create a network topography, and then you simply assign the confidence levels, who the triage of repeat misinformation spreaders are. And so you could say, okay, for this person, if we want to destroy their influence, we won't, if it hits this trigger, they won't be banned, but we will the amplification funnel is this public figure is amplified most by these 6 or 7 lieutenant type accounts, who frequently amplify it. But the public doesn't really know who they are, or doesn't really care about them. It won't be a political or international incident. So we'll just take those accounts out, or we'll do called like a random partial de-amplification, where they would say, okay, we don't necessarily go after the person we want to take out or their top lieutenants, but simply create the network topography of everybody who amplifies their account and just randomly de-amplify or randomly ban the accounts or shadow ban the accounts of 35 or 65% of those very, very small accounts, but in the aggregate make up a large portion of the amplification. So that was kind of the AI Death Star, and it destroyed the 2020 election in this country. I frequently cite how, for example, the Department of Homeland Security here in the U.S. partnered with the Stanford Internet Observatory, the University of Washington, the Atlantic Council, Graphica, Harvard Belfer Center, all these outside groups to pre-censor the 2020 election. Anyone who, quote, delegitimized election processes or results by questioning the trustworthiness of electronic voting machines or mass mail-in ballots. All of that was coerced into being a terms of service violation under threat of government regulation and fines and disfavor from a Biden administration. But that was enforced using AI. They used AI to scan the internet for all of the keywords associated with that: ballot harvesting, voter fraud, Stop the Steal, anything about Dominion or Smartmatic, all of this. And they would look at who was amplifying Trump tweets at the time when he was saying, don't do this. Then they would go and do the exact same thing for COVID through things like the Virality Project and the Graphica military contractors working with NATO to zap that out the moment COVID broke out. But all of that relies on huge amounts of data ingestion. Absolutely huge. You have to create, if you want to create that kind of sophisticated network map of the disinformation spreaders, you have to ingest all of their tweets. You have to be able to fine tune that data. So for example, what in 2020, they ingested 859 million tweets during the election cycle, and then used the AI to assess that 22 million of those 859 million were misinformation or relating to a misinformation narrative. They didn't manually read 22 million tweets, but because they could scrape the data from Twitter, they could create this Death Star. The Death Star was powered by the data ingestion. The very first time Elon ever amplified me, or I think probably ever saw my account, I was walking on a hike in Santa Monica. I think it was the Hollywood Hills. And I was just recording one of these walk and talk videos. And the title of the video was Elon accidentally stepped on a DARPA rattlesnake. And it was just like a 9 or 12 minute, just kind of, I'm like breathing heavy. We're walking through the, mountains. And I was explaining how this policy that Elon had just passed, and folks may remember this. It was an interesting thing. It was about 2 years ago. It was the rate limit. What Elon did is, I think it was something like it started as 2,000 posts a day, and then it went up to 5,000 or 10,000. And depending on your premium membership, it might go up to 20,000 or so. But you could only read a certain amount of tweets per day. You could only access a certain amount. Now, no single human is going to be like regularly exceeding 20,000, clicking on 20,000 tweets a day. That's just an incredible amount of volume. But if you are AI, if you are a bot, and I think, frankly, he probably did it because of bot farm issues and all the problems he inherited from bot farms from Twitter 1.0. I don't even think that he knew what he was, the impact this would have. Maybe he did. But the fact is when he put that rate limit on, you can't scrape 859 million tweets. You can't scrape billions of tweets as they did over COVID. The other thing he did very shortly before or after that was he changed the pricing on the API that was the plugin that allows other software or outside labs to be able to access Twitter data. He changed the price on it from a couple $100 a month to a couple $100,000 a month, I think, or $100,000. It was some huge amount of money, so that it became prohibitively expensive to access the data on the platform side, which is another way to scrape, all of the tweets. That meant that Google could afford it comfortably. Facebook could afford it comfortably. Microsoft could afford it comfortably if they want to pay to try to get that, platform side to be able to get essentially around the rate limit, to be able to scrape all this data, because now you can just get it through the API. But that meant that all these NGOs, all of these university centers, all these pop-up censorship mercenary firms that are surviving on $250K a year from the State Department or USAID or the UK Foreign Office, they can't pay over $1 million a year just for that and keep the levels that they have. And so they went dark in terms of their ability to actually micro-target and adjust up and down their targets, their pressure on the platforms. They had to become reactive. That is, things had to go viral, and they had to see them before they flagged them to the platforms and said, we're the Carnegie Endowment of International Peace, and if you want the State Department to protect you from international regulations in Pakistan, you better take down Nigel Farage's tweets about immigration. They had to wait for a Nigel Farage tweet to go viral first, because they couldn't pre-censor these things with the precision necessary. This is why they want the data compelled from the DSA.
So that killed AI censorship. That was it when Elon did that. That killed AI censorship effectively.
It radically depowered it. I wouldn't say killed it, but it turned it from something that would blow up entire planets to something that it went from being kind of a nuclear weapon, I guess, to being a Moab. One of those.
Do you know whether Elon did that intentionally for that purpose?
Weirdly, bot farms and lots of other things rely on big data ingestion to cause the problems they do.
Several problems, right?
I think he probably understands it now, and I know that Twitter 1.0 was intensely aware of the pressure they were under from these civil society organizations and the like. I don't know if it was Jack Dorsey, but I remember seeing very high-level Twitter 1.0 executives saying that they felt the most pressure from these outside researcher groups, even more than from traditional media like the Washington Post saying we're going to write something dirty about you, because these civil society institutions were connected to these advertiser boycotts, and they would pressure them. Hi, I'm from the University of Washington, or I'm from Harvard, but we also, we're working with these NewsGuard type groups who are being funded by have these deep connections with the supply side advertisers, and it'd be a shame if something, nice business, it'd be a shame if something happened to you. And so I know that Elon felt pressure from that. I mean, he bought, basically as he was buying Twitter, he got a threat letter from 26 NGOs saying that they'd be leading a boycott crusade to bankrupt the company unless he brought back the trust and safety team. If you remember, you saw the same thing with, was it Imran Ahmed and it's the British censorship shop.
Oh yes, Center for
Countering Digital Hate.
Yes,
yeah, CCDH. And if you remember, when the leaked documents came out with their internal reports, the number one priority item was kill Musk's Twitter. That was the top. That was in their monthly donor report as a nonprofit. Which skates by tax laws by saying that they're effectively a humanitarian charity, and their number one action item is to kill Twitter through effectively ad boycotts and regulatory pressure.
If anyone wants to see just how deranged that group are, I recommend the trigonometry interview with. You saw that one, and he seems to sort of combust, have a little sort of brain meltdown in front of Konstantin's questioning. So this. You're saying the Digital Service Act is going to is an attempt to revive the old system, so that they have back that power, which is basically the most effective way of censorship.
Yes, it's the Empire Strikes Back. Like we, not to use a cheesy Star Wars analogy, but I'll go ahead. I mean, this thing was this kind of Death Star weapon. It completely killed the ability to challenge COVID. It completely killed the ability to challenge the election processes we used in the 2020 election. You had no hope. You were pre-censored at the outset. Any terms, slogans, evidence, news articles can completely, through the AI, pre-censored, not even a shot. And then, Elon sort of starts this, flying this little brigade of X-Wings into the exhaust pipe of, the rate limits and the API. Mark Zuckerberg follows suit. He prevents external access to what was called CrowdTangle, which was a tool to access the big data and build AI models on Facebook and Meta data, which was huge. CrowdTangle was a huge weapon that they used. But what the EU DSA does is one of the requirements is vetted researchers are forced to, the platforms are forced to turn this over to outside vetted researchers. You and I don't qualify because we're not,
we're not indoctrinated.
We're EU critical. Now, if we bent the knee and we changed our editorial line, we could start an NGO in a heartbeat and get credentialed for that sort of thing. But what's happening is you're essentially saying the platforms, oh no, this is narrowly tailored so that it's not overly onerous on free enterprise and, the sovereignty of a private corporation. It's just going to be a few of these outside groups. There are a bunch of these signatories to the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation, and then they're implementers. And these implementer groups get access to this, and then they can turn that into these hyper-targeting models, and it basically forces the Death Star to be able to be turned back on. And that threat is an enormous one. But it takes two to tango. It takes a government to compel the platforms to do it, and it takes the platforms to, essentially capitulate to pressure that, those who are developing these models and rolling them out, in order to take action on it. But that action can be compelled through government force, which is what the EU and UK and Brazil and others are trying to do now.
So when earlier in this year, J.D. Vance insisted that there would be no UK trade deal with the US unless something was done about the free speech problem. The fact not only that was at the meeting earlier in the year, I think February, but that was several meetings. Vance continued to insist there was no free speech, no trade deal. I think it's an actual quote he said. Mm-hmm. But when it actually came to signing the deal, both the secretary in the States overlooking it, Howard Lutnick, as well as the British business secretary, said throughout all the negotiations, free speech has not been part of it. It had played no part whatsoever.
Right.
So now, with the Digital Service Act, why should we think that there would be with the EU when there wasn't with the UK, despite what the administration said?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. I have seen reporting that it is stalled currently on that basis. Reclaim the Net had a good summary article on that. I mean, the EU is a much bigger market than the UK, and much more is on the line. There are also many EU member states with politically sensitive elections and associated movements that are, I think, politically sensitive. And like when I think about something like Hungary and Poland, Germany, Italy, Spain, and there's so many of these countries where what happens there is there's not that kind of U.S.-UK special relationship where there is some sort of perception that neither side will push the other too far. This is why this 4chan case I come to it, because this is really the first enforcement action of that threat come to life, and it's against a fringe website, who nobody's going to stick up for because of the kind of stuff that's posted there.
Well, I'd like to come to that, but it sort of sounds like actually with you're not in a position to really know until we see the deal whether there is, I guess. But I personally come from a position where, having seen what happened, I don't have that much hope that the EU will be treated differently by the US than what happened in the UK. So,
well, I'm not here to sell hope, but what I'll say is I know that the White House is aware of the magnitude of the threat.
Right. So we should talk about then the UK and 4chan. For background, we should touch on the Online Safety Act, which was once the Online Harms Bill, started by a Conservative government under Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries, and Boris Johnson's government, and has just come into full swing under the Labour Sir Keir Starmer government about a month or so ago. Included in the Online Safety Act, which I had the displeasure of reading in full, is the same thing you mentioned of the Digital Service Act, is that the UK government will have the ability to sue American tech companies or overseas companies if they breach whatever rules they decide on global revenue in the tens of millions. So it affects big tech, it affects social media owners, American social media owners. And actually this week in Washington, whilst we've been here, Jim Jordan, who you've also mentioned, the congressman, was heading up the congressional hearings about the issue, which Nigel Farage was over testifying about. So that came to pass, and already you also mentioned there's a disinformation unit. That was another part of the Online Safety Act. And take me from that to this 4chan situation. You've already laid a little bit of the ground on that story, but if you can tell it to me then.
Yeah. Frankly, the only reason that there is a Online Safety Act is because of Brexit, for two reasons.
I'm going to push back on that, but I'll go on.
It's just the EU DSA. In many respects, it's the EU DSA, but for the UK. These things were drafted in tandem.
Yes.
It's a constant. What I mean by that, in that sense, is if the UK was still part of the EU, there would probably just be the DSA.
Yes.
But because it's not, you need that censorship law, UK specific, and so it's the Online Harms Bill, Online Safety Act. It's that corollary.
Can I just add color to that?
Yeah.
Sorry. It starts with a young 14-year-old girl who committed suicide. Her name was Molly Russell. And that, I think, was 2017. And then by 2022, a Conservative MP called David Amos was killed by an Islamist. And the reaction was, we've got to sort online hate out. That's where the Online Safety Act, or the Online Harms Bill, as it was then called, emerged in Britain specifically. Now, I'm sure you're right that part of the anti-populist establishment ideology was behind a lot of the decision making.
Yeah, the Brexit referendum happened because of the popularity of Nigel and the movement on social media, the same way Trump was. And beginning right after that, these pop-up groups like Hate Lab, for example. Hate Lab.
Hate Lab.
Yeah, that's what it's called. You can look it up. They, I think, started in 2013 to kind of help the British government by create kind of a dashboard of like terrorist organizations and the kind of speech that they used. And in 2016, after the Brexit referendum, they pivoted to Brexit supporters. And they said, the Brexit movement is associated with hate. There are hate incidents that happen all over the UK because of Brexit. We're going to create for the Metropolitan Police Department, and we're going to create for British police authorities a real-time radar system of all speech on the internet everywhere across the entire United Kingdom, and it's powered by AI. And what it does is it's a real-time readout of every tweet, every Facebook post, every YouTube video, because every YouTube video has speech-to-text transliteration. The AI reads the back end, like it reads the text equivalent, whether it's a video or a Facebook post or a tweet. It assesses a toxicity score. That if the toxicity score exceeds a certain threshold, it gets beamed directly into the British Police Department to assess whether or not that is a criminal violation for a hate speech event. And if you go to the Hate Lab dashboard, what you will see is every category of wrongthink: gender identity, race identity, extremist rhetoric, religious identity. It's anti-immigrant speech. And it is a real-time AI-powered censorship Death Star that literally is beamed straight to the police so that the police don't spend their day. There are 12,000 people arrested a year for hate speech and online posts in the UK now, according to the Times, I think, in April. And that number's probably higher now.
30 a day, yeah.
30 a day, I think, came out to 12,000 a year. That is not, some random security guard or, just unit who's just scrolling through their own feed on X every day and just arresting opinions they don't like. They get a real-time heat map. It's literally a heat map of, this is their Hate Lab dashboard. Everyone can look this up. And you know who funded that in part? The U.S. Justice Department. This is part of the plot to kill Brexit on both sides of the Atlantic. So you have you have this US-UK plot to kill each other's mutual enemies, so that this transatlantic blob, the US government was helping the British government take out the Brexit movement, derail the Brexit movement, take them off of social media, get them arrested. And we saw the same thing with the Brits in the Biden administration. This was broken by America First Legal, Stephen Miller. This was his and Gene Hamilton, their legal shop. They filed suit and obtained documents from the White House of joint meetings with the UK Foreign Office and the UK Digital Ministry when they traveled to Washington and held this White House and interagency coordination summit on disinformation. And in attendance were not just the primary members of the Biden White House, but members from the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, USAID, U.S. ODNI, the U.S. Pentagon, and it was their joint counter-disinformation playbook. And on one of the slides, everyone can look this up. Just go to the America First Legal X account and simply put in the word UK in the targeted search, and you'll see all these slides. It's also on my X feed. It's at Mike Benz Cyber. And you will see that actually in one of the pages of the slide deck, very early on, it's on page 3 or 4 of it, they have a section about what they're doing in the UK that will help reduce misinformation in the US. And the first thing on the bullet point list is the Online Safety Act. That law, even though it's targeted to the UK, is going to have these international ripple effects, and it will help solve the global problem about online misinformation. This is direct coordination. And the Biden administration did this with EU-wide. They did this with Brazil, actually on whitehouse.gov, the very first meeting that President Biden had with President Lula from Brazil. The whitehouse.gov press release says that they included conversations about digital resilience and combating online disinformation. It's the same.
What year was that meeting at the White House?
I believe it was either, I think it was 2022 or 2023.
It has to be later.
Yeah, it may have been
Online
2020.
Safety Act
Yeah,
would have been talked about from 22.
Well, they talked about it as it was pending, I think.
Right.
So I think it was before it was enacted.
Right. And sorry, the Hate Lab.
Yes.
Is this an independent organization, or is it?
I think it's affiliated with the University of Cardiff, I believe.
Okay.
But this is how they love laundering this stuff through the faux academics. This revolving door between government officials, intelligence agencies, and university fronts. So they say, well, this is curated and, created by academics in order to help advise law enforcement and policymakers about real-time threats from hate speech and misinformation on the internet, primarily stemming from the Brexit movement. And so I think I believe it's also funded by at least one UK government agency, and I think an EU body provides funding as well. I'd have to confirm that, but they have the funding currently they'll probably, most of the time when I mention these types of organizations, the websites go dark within 3 weeks. So if you're listening right now, go to Hate Lab's website, archive.org, archive.is, download the file locally, because this is very, very dirty stuff. And it received U.S. government funding. It definitely received British government funding. And I believe it also received EU government funding. And that's basically all of the players, while it's housed as who can disagree with the academics? Yeah. But that's how I believe it's structured.
Just the full house for the.
They're not the only ones, by the way, I should note, who are doing this, but they were one of the early players in it.
Well, a Center for Countering Disinformation would be online hate.
Yeah, there's a million of these. I mean, look at what our Disinformation Governance Board Chief Nina Jankovic did after she was terminated and the Disinformation Governance Board was dissolved in the U.S. That was probably the sea change moment in terms of public awareness of government censorship and contravention of the First Amendment. What did she do right after? She went straight to London, to the Center for Information Resilience, funded by USAID, and she registered under our Foreign Agent Registration Act as a British agent, I believe.
Yeah. So in Britain now, there's a lot of anti-government sentiment. I mean, it didn't help that Starmer came to power on only 20% of the electorate, but he's become wildly unpopular, even more so since. Jim, I say that all of that we've talked about happened under conservative governments, but Jim Jordan, the congressman, exposed about 2 months ago interactions between Starmer's members of Starmer's team and American big tech, and he's put this up. He's put it up on his X, so you can see the actual emails where the Starmer's team asked these tech companies to throttle, or I think maybe the word might have been tackle, or to keep an eye on the use of the term two-tier when it's happening.
Two-tier care.
Two-tier care in Britain. So I wondered if you had any insight into how things have changed under our new government, or what the latest was with regards to the British censorship industrial complex.
Well, it does rely considerably on this special relationship and constant interchange. In the same way that, if rogue figures within the U.S. intelligence community want to do something that to swing domestic politics, but they're banned, the CIA can't operate, on American soil against American citizens. So, they'll reach out to their British friends, and the Brits will do it, and vice versa. And so this is how we got Russiagate with Christopher Steele and the Richard Dearlove network, while you had our own head of the CIA, John Brennan, cooking up in the background. The technical operation for the dossier was done on the British side, because if it was done by the CIA, then, they're not allowed to operate here like this. But the fact is it's the same thing in the censorship space. When there's really dirty work that the Biden administration wanted done against the Trump movement or Trump government, they would go to British NGOs. That's why we fund all of this. The State Department and USAID funds almost, or at least funded until very recently, almost every major player in the British censorship space, funded or partnered directly with. And everything, the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, Cardiff, Sheffield, the King's College, the London School of all
funding them to do
to combat mis and disinformation online, because it's a threat to democracy, and so they get democracy promotion funds in order to reduce threats to democratic institutions and things that undermine public faith and confidence in scientific consensus, or trust high information integrity news media. They just define institution to mean anything they want to remain in power, and then they say that democracy is those institutions. So anything that attacks those institutions is a threat to democracy, and that's how all these university centers, NGOs, for-profit censorship mercenary firms in London and the UK get millions and millions of dollars of U.S. government funding. But that also helps them here in the U.S., because now you're kind of neutering what Fleet Street can cover. You're killing this international exchange of ideas. You're killing the amplification, and you're stopping the emergence of a Trump ally in the UK.
Look, you've painted a picture of my country and Europe, and as it's so much worse than I had imagined before. But we are in the States, and as I started by this conversation, you are very much being listened to by the administration, and it seems that this is an administration that at least proclaims to be very pro-free speech, have been outspoken against censorship. I wanted your appraisal a few months into this second term of Trump, about how you think it's going, what more needs to be done here in the States, and what successes have there been and what failures have there been?
There has been a shocking amount of success. I thought it would take all 4 years to get a quarter of what we've gotten done in 9 months. And by we, I mean the Trump administration, free speech activists. But I'll particularly talk about executive branch policy successes. The shutdown of USAID, termination of 14,000 government employees at that institution, is absolutely massive. It actually kind of forces these countries to put in laws like the EU DSA or the UK Online Safety Act or these Brazil edicts, because if it's not legally compelled, these NGOs just don't have the funds to police this stuff and use advertiser boycotts and the like to generate enough commercial pressure on the companies. So the only way to do that is to force that is through government force. So there is this kind of paradoxical kind of brinksmanship about this. But the fact is these institutions that I mentioned in the UK were funded by USAID, and they are not anymore. And that is a massive win. It's changed the market for this. It's made the global market for being in the censorship business a bad business to be in. We talk a lot about the censorship industrial complex, and a lot of people focus on the complex part of that. Oh, it's a complex. The operative word there is industrial. It's a business. These are not charity pro bono people who just do it for the love of the game. They just love flagging people's posts. It is a big, big, big money because it's big power. It's not just power for governments and political movements and political action committees. It's even power for corporations because they have the access to influence hearts and minds. If Exxon wants to, get money, from the government of Nigeria, they can lobby the State Department or they can put USAID funds to define disinformation a certain way in Nigeria will, potentially get them a, $1 billion pipeline deal. It became a huge business. Billions rushed into the space in a very, very short period of years. And there have been hundreds of millions of dollars of grants already cut. From USAID, from the U.S. State Department, we shut down and terminated the Global Engagement Center, which was the OG of this whole space. That was the very first censorship government agency in the U.S. government way before the Disinformation Governance Board. Nobody cared at the time because it was set up to censor ISIS propaganda, and we had this ISIS, craze. And so, but then it transitioned to trying to stop ISIS to trying to stop Trump because we said, oh, well, Russian disinformation and propaganda, we can take that on too because it's hostile foreign nation state threat, kind of like ISIS. But then they just defined, every Trump supporter is a, Putin lover. And so anything pro-Trump became pro-Putin. But that's now been terminated. $60 million budget, 55 full-time government jobs, State Department completely gone. There's a full-scale reorganization of the State Department to clean this out of every aspect of it. We had this bureau, the Democracy, Rights, and Labor Bureau. That was the major operational vector. It's been completely changed at the leadership level and at the operational level. The National Science Foundation, which was the biggest domestic money expenditure for social media censorship organizations, $100 million, at least $100 million that I've tracked alone in grants with the keywords misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, infodemic, and like $100 million just from the National Science Foundation was given out during the Biden administration to fund dozens of universities, 60 universities, all these different for-profit censorship groups. We created all these different track programs, the Track F Convergence Accelerator program, just give to create basically be a venture. The National Science Foundation was like a venture capital firm investing in for-profit censorship ventures, almost like In-Q-Tel does with the CIA, to help them create AI censorship software. Like they created this company called WiseDex, the National Science Foundation, which was for fast, precise, and comprehensive AI censorship of COVID misinformation. So it would take terms like negative efficacy, like vaccines don't work, and it would, create these toxicity scores, and it would break down the lexicon, not just for what people in America were saying, but there would be the Spanish translation, the Portuguese translation, and it was funded by the National Science Foundation, or something like Course Correct, which is another one of these AI censorship weapons at $5.7 million funded to create a dynamic disinformation dashboard. And the way it worked is the National Science Foundation funded, I believe it was the University of Michigan working with this Course Correct project so that they could provide journalists with this dynamic disinformation dashboard so that the journalists could tell the tech platforms to take it down or else they'd suffer bad press and ad boycotts. So you had all four quadrants of the whole of society map. This is this government, private sector, civil society, media. That's how this space operates. This is what their incantation, whole of society, whole of society. And that one project alone, the money came from the government. It went to civil society, the academics working with their computer science departments to create this AI-based dynamic disinformation dashboard, everything that's disinformation on the internet today. That is then sold to journalists so that they can just immediately track everything that's deemed disinformation. Then the journalists can pressure the tech platforms to take it down. Wow. And so, but all that stuff is cut. It is now a keyword ban at the National Science Foundation. You cannot put the word misinformation, disinformation, infodemic, digital literacy. You can't put these terms in your grant application without triggering this red flag and with the presumption that the grant is not eligible because it's going to infringe on the work is going to infringe on First Amendment protected free speech. DHS has been the censorship center there has been completely gutted. NIH, HHS guts are being throttled back. There's still a lot more to do there, but it's been all for the positive. And I can go on and on. I mean, it's been absolutely massive. And because it's been so massive, there's been this attempted offset. The American censors in exile are getting defunded. They're having to run to mommy and daddy Soros and Knight Foundation and Omidyar Foundation. Go to YouTube and look at, just type in the search terms like private foundation funding disinformation, and you will just see dozens of these NGOs having consensus stakeholder meetings about how the Knight Foundation has to chip in more money and the Omidyar Foundation and the Gates Foundation has to chip in more money. And they are, though. The Gates Foundation committed to, what was it, $200 billion? I think, no, over the course of, I think, 10 or 20 years. So it's like $10 or $20 billion a year.
Since Doge.
Yes, right.
So to step in. So they're consciously stepping in.
Right.
Bill Gates is consciously, or the foundation.
Right. And they're having to. And the EU is now creating offset funds for this funding too. The EU launched this new science fund to attract American scientists and researchers who have been gutted by U.S. aid cuts and grant cuts. So, like I said, all this stuff is laundered under the thin veneer of science because they're simply studying the flow of disinformation. So, but
Soros, do we know anything about whether he's stepping in?
I've not seen a commitment specifically on disinformation grounds, but they're certainly being lobbied. The stakeholders are being included in these meetings. They're mentioned in the potential alternative pools of funding. NATO appears to be giving grants around social cohesion. And we know in the NATO 2030 strategic concept, they called for a 24/7 disinformation monitoring system powered by artificial intelligence. That's
really,
look that up. It's on my X. Just type in 24/7 disinformation monitoring, artificial intelligence, NATO. You'll just see the documents yourself.
Wow. Okay, so we started off hopeful, and now it looks actually things are not. There is a fight back.
We are
despite
winning.
The wins that the administration having. There is now a fight back.
Right. I think these Western institutions in Europe, in the UK, and adjacent spaces did not want to have to do something radical that could be used against themselves in terms of diplomatic rhetoric as being infringements on free speech, because that was such a powerful weapon on normative grounds, on diplomatic and universal human rights grounds. It made sense to sanction North Korea or Iran when they arrested a journalist. They would only step in, just being frank, if it was a CIA back or a UK Foreign Office back journal. I mean, this thing was always the kind of self-interested aspect of free speech diplomacy in the Cold War. But the fact is the fact that there was a hard legal distinction between the laws of the Soviet Union, the laws behind the Iron Curtain, and the laws in the United States and the UK and our transatlantic partners we could easily define what authoritarianism was versus what democracy was on the basis of freedom of speech, freedom of association, the Western these kind of civil liberties and human rights. And we could point to a million examples. It was very easy to caricature, to create that picture, because there were simply things that they did, things that, even though we had our own methods of repression in various ways, there were red lines we would not cross. And they are now at the point where we've crossed these red lines. We've crossed them in Europe, for example, with the DSA, with the Online Safety Act. We've not crossed them so far that, for example, I mentioned 4chan being sued is a different thing than, $100 billion fine against Facebook or something that's like such a large amount they take action, or a high-level U.S. political figure. Again, they always start these things with these marginal figures and create the legal tapestry and create the momentum and the stakeholder buy-in, and you sort of boil the frog and get used to it. That's why they couldn't censor. They censored everyone around Trump before they censored Trump. And this led to conservatives being able to deny that there was a political targeting of censorship in 2017, 2018. Republicans in Congress said, "What do you mean censorship? I don't see any censorship." And it was because it was the people just to the right of them, or it was people, who just had an issue they didn't care about. But what I'm saying is you see 12,000 arrests in Britain. I forget the multiple, so I don't want to misquote it, but it is like orders of magnitude more than get arrested in Russia.
Yes.
Orders of magnitude more than in Russia. And that argument that what distinguishes a free society from one under the thumb of a dictator is people being arrested for journalism and free expression is an argument that
or
is
jokes.
hard, right? Or jokes is an argument that gets harder and harder to make, and it has. I think it's part of this kind of dissolving set of alliances and this restructuring of a lot of the alliance structure as Europe, the US, China, India, and Russia are reshuffling because of sanctions policy around Ukraine, because of trade and tariffs, and the human rights cudgel, the civil liberties cudgel, is now a lot less powerful than it was because we've lost credibility. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs stood at the Joe Biden Democracy Summit and pointed out how hypocritical it was for the United States to complain about free speech in China because China had never censored their own president.
But by the way, I think about a month ago in Hong Kong, the authorities are giving the example of America and saying there's not free speech there. Why should you have free speech here? In the case for Jimmy Lai, who's the guy behind Apple News, who's been in jail for some time now. And so they're literally, I think they even reference, maybe it was Britain they referenced, but the point being they're referencing countries in the West who don't have free speech and say, why should you have free speech here? So, an authoritarian, totalitarian CCP government is literally looking at us as a point of comparison. It's nuts.
But rightly so. I mean, that is, unfortunately, until these things are repealed, because it's not just the hearts and minds argument. When these things get litigated in courts, a judge, if they're objective at all, has to look at, okay, well, if this is, international law and the UN Declaration on Human Rights of free speech, or, is this really a violation of the UN Charter if China is doing it when it's actually worse in many respects in the UK, or if it's okay here. So there is this international norm setting, these global principles. And I just think it's the diplomatic backlash is already significant, and it could compound to something enormous that could completely reshuffle alliance structures if it escalates.
Yeah. Mike Benz, a great pleasure speaking. We've covered a hell of a lot of territory there. It's been absolutely fascinating. I was looking forward very much to this conversation, and you did not disappoint me. I'm going to take the conversation onto our Substack, where not only are you going to take a few questions from our listeners, but I'm going to ask you about your opinion of how Trump has dealt with the Epstein situation, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
We're going to take over to the Substack. Before we do that, is there anything you'd like to point viewers and listeners to that follow you on? You already mentioned on X, you're at Mike Benz Cyber. And you...
My foundation, you can find my foundation's Foundation for Freedom Online, all one word.com. We have articles several times a week on there, deep dive reports on every aspect of what we just talked about. You can also find my video archive on YouTube and Rumble.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Winston.
There's a lot of frustration from Trump supporters about how he's dealt with the quote-unquote Epstein files.
If they wanted to find the answers, they could.
I'm going to give you some quick-fire questions from our audience. Do we have a leftist problem more than an illegal immigration problem in the West?
God, I wish that was true. Refugee programs are USAID programs in disguise.
So it's all of these other vested interests that are deeper down.
Because if it was just that, you could change it in one election. And
thanks for watching The Winston Marshall Show with Mike Benz. Don't forget to check out the extended version of this conversation over on Substack. And if you liked that video and want to support what we do, please like, subscribe, and share this video with others. It helps us more than you know. And remember to check out today's sponsor, Private Internet Access, a VPN you can trust so your information stream isn't censored by visiting piavpn.com/Winston Marshall. But until next time, be well.